Chapter 1. The Arrival of the Harpers. The sun hung low in the late afternoon sky, casting a warm glow over the old farmhouse nestled deep in the countryside. The house stood tall, its white paint peeling with age, and its once bright windows now dull and clouded by time. The Harpers had found the property after months of searching for a peaceful retreat, a place where they could escape the clamor of the city and start fresh. The moment Evelyn Harper laid eyes on it, she knew it was the one. It had a charm, a history, something that called to her. Jacob Harper pulled the moving truck into the long gravel driveway, its wheels crunching over the stones as it slowed to a stop in front of the house. He stepped out, stretching his legs as he surveyed their new home. Behind him, Evelyn climbed out of their car, taking a deep breath of the crisp, country air. Their children, Olivia and Sam, followed, wide-eyed and full of wonder at the vast open land that surrounded them. A worn barn stood to the left, and towering trees lined the property like silent sentinels. Evelyn approached the front porch, her footsteps echoing off the wooden boards. The house seemed to watch her as she drew near, its quiet presence looming over her like a shadow. She hesitated for a moment at the door, the key in her hand, feeling a strange, fleeting unease. But it was quickly dismissed as excitement bubbled up within her once more. This was their new beginning. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. The house was cold inside, colder than she had expected, despite the warm glow of the evening sun outside. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the beams of light that filtered through the curtains. The furniture had been left behind by the previous owners, heavy, old-fashioned pieces that gave the place an antique feel. Evelyn ran her hand over the banister of the staircase, feeling the rough wood beneath her fingers. Jacob followed her inside, carrying a box of their belongings, his footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. The children rushed past them, eager to explore their new home. Their laughter echoed down the hallway as they raced through the rooms, their small feet tapping on the hardwood floors. Evelyn smiled as she listened to them, but there was something about the sound that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should have. A cold draft brushed against her skin, and she shivered. Jacob began unpacking in the living room, setting boxes down near the fireplace. He knelt to inspect the hearth, running his hands along the edges of the stone. It had been years since the fireplace had been used, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the mantel. As he stood, he noticed something odd, faint scratches on the floor beneath the rug. His brow furrowed in confusion, but he shook his head and shrugged it off. Old houses always had their quirks. Evelyn wandered through the house, her footsteps quiet as she moved from room to room. Each space felt heavier than the last, as though time had settled in the walls, holding its breath, waiting. She entered the master bedroom and found herself drawn to the large bay window that overlooked the yard. The view was beautiful, wide open fields stretching out toward the horizon, but her attention was caught by something else. Far in the distance, past the barn and the trees, stood a dark, looming figure, unmoving and shadowed. She blinked, her heart skipping a beat, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. A chill ran down her spine. She pressed her hand to the window, trying to make sense of what she had seen, but there was nothing there now, just the wind rustling through the trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the house grew darker, its corners fading into shadow. Jacob lit a fire in the hearth, the flames crackling and dancing as they filled the room with warmth. The children, tired from their day of excitement, curled up on the worn sofa, their eyes heavy with sleep. Evelyn joined them, sitting close to Jacob as they watched the fire flicker and burn. The warmth felt comforting, but the house remained cold. Even with the flames blazing, a deep chill lingered in the air, as though the walls themselves were frozen. Night settled over the house, wrapping it in silence. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows in their frames. Inside, the house seemed to exhale, its old timbers creaking under the weight of the darkness. Evelyn lay awake in bed, listening to the sounds of the night. The creaking floorboards, the shifting of the walls, the distant whisper of the wind. They all blended together, forming an unsettling melody. She turned to Jacob, who was fast asleep beside her, his breathing steady and calm. But Evelyn could not shake the feeling that something was off. The house, once so inviting, now felt oppressive, as though it was watching them, waiting for something. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but the unease gnawed at her mind. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from downstairs. Evelyn's eyes snapped open. Her heart raced as she strained to hear what had caused the noise. It came again, this time louder. She sat up in bed, holding her breath. The noise came once more, a steady, rhythmic pounding coming from the direction of the living room. Evelyn slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Jacob, and crept down the hallway. The house seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. Each step she took was slow and deliberate, her heart hammering in her chest. As she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. Below, in the living room, she saw it, a figure standing by the fireplace, its back turned to her. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its form distorted by the flickering light of the dying fire. It was still, unnaturally still, as though it wasn't breathing, wasn't alive. Evelyn's throat tightened in fear as she watched it. The figure's head slowly turned, just enough for her to see its face, or lack of one. There were no eyes, no mouth, just an empty, dark void where a face should have been. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart racing in terror. She blinked, and the figure was gone, as though it had never been there at all. She stood frozen at the top of the stairs, the pounding of her heartbeat deafening in the silence. The house was still, the shadows unmoving, and yet the sense of dread clung to her, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. The Harpers had arrived, but something else had been waiting for them. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Night. The following morning, the Harper household stirred to life beneath a soft, gray sky. Evelyn awoke to the sound of birds chirping faintly outside, but the brightness of a new day did little to dispel the lingering heaviness that had settled over her the previous night. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, the memory of the shadowy figure by the fireplace replaying in her mind. She told herself it had been a trick of the light, a fleeting nightmare brought on by the stress of moving, but the unease in her chest refused to let go. Jacob had already risen, the sound of him moving around downstairs reaching her ears. She forced herself out of bed, running her hand through her hair as she glanced toward the window. The fields beyond the house seemed peaceful, bathed in a soft morning mist, but there was something unnerving about the way the fog clung to the land, as if it were hiding something just beyond the trees. Downstairs, the house felt different in the light of day, less menacing, though still unfamiliar. The fire had long since died in the hearth, leaving the room cold once again. The air felt stagnant, unmoving, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Evelyn entered the kitchen, where Jacob was pouring coffee into a chipped mug. He smiled at her, his expression weary, and motioned for her to sit down. She did, wrapping her hands around the warmth of the cup he placed before her. The children, Olivia and Sam, ran through the kitchen on their way outside, their youthful energy undiminished by the strangeness of their new home. Evelyn watched them through the window as they disappeared into the mist, their laughter carrying back to her in faint echoes. For a moment, it was almost easy to believe that everything was normal, that they were simply a family settling into a new life, free from any burdens. But the house seemed to have other plans. As Evelyn cleaned up after breakfast, a sound caught her attention, a faint, almost imperceptible noise that came from the far side of the house. It was soft, like the whisper of a breeze through a cracked window, but there were no open windows. The sound grew slightly louder, a subtle hissing noise, as if something unseen was shifting in the walls. She froze, listening intently, her eyes scanning the room for the source. The noise seemed to come from behind the kitchen wall, near the pantry. Slowly, Evelyn approached the wall, her heart beginning to race again as the sound became clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something that almost sounded like a voice. An indistinct murmur, like someone was speaking too softly to be heard. Evelyn pressed her ear to the wall, straining to catch the words. But there were no words, just the low, rhythmic hum of the whispering sound. She stepped back, her skin crawling with unease. For the second time in less than 24 hours, the house seemed to be hiding something. Deciding to ignore it for now, she returned to her tasks, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching her. But the noise continued, faint and constant, following her through the house as she moved from room to room. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing out these soft, maddening whispers. Outside, the children's laughter broke through her thoughts, and she stepped onto the porch to check on them. The fog had begun to lift, but the yard still felt distant, almost otherworldly, as if the land surrounding the house didn't quite belong to the same world she inhabited. Olivia and Sam were chasing each other around the barn, their carefree joy a stark contrast to the oppressive feeling that clung to the house behind her. Evelyn watched them for a while, hoping their innocence might somehow alleviate the growing tension within her, but the weight of the house's presence followed her even outside. It was as though the very air was heavy with anticipation, waiting for something to happen. Later in the afternoon, while Jacob worked on repairing some of the house's more neglected features, Evelyn decided to unpack more of their belongings. She moved upstairs, where the bedroom stood silent and still. The hallway stretched long and narrow, and every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed amplified in the quiet space. The light filtering through the small windows was dim, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. As she entered the master bedroom, Evelyn's eyes were drawn to the bay window where she had seen the strange figure in the distance the night before. The fields were empty now, bathed in the pale light of early afternoon. Yet, the memory of that faceless figure lingered in her mind, and the uneasy feeling of being watched returned. She turned away from the window and began unpacking a box near the dresser. As she worked, the same whispering sound from earlier crept into her awareness once more, this time louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from behind the walls again, as if the house was trying to communicate something to her. She paused, her hands frozen in mid-motion, and glanced around the room. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it almost felt like it was surrounding her. She couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore. It seemed to be everywhere at once, circling around her like a distant chant. Her breath quickened as she stood in the center of the room, her ears straining to decipher the sound. The whispers felt close now, as if they were pressing against her skin, filling her mind with a cold, prickling sensation. Without warning, the bedroom door slammed shut behind her, the sudden noise shattering the stillness of the room. Evelyn gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed to the door and yanked it open, her pulse racing. The hallway beyond was empty, and the house was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. She stood there for a long moment, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe, her breath shallow and ragged. The house felt alive, its presence unmistakable now. Whatever had happened last night wasn't her imagination. It was real, and it was growing stronger. That night, after the children were tucked into bed and Jacob had fallen asleep, Evelyn lay awake once again. The house was dark and silent, but the whispers had returned, this time fainter, barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. She closed her eyes, trying to ignore them, but they slipped into her mind like a subtle poison, seeping into her thoughts until all she could hear was the endless murmur of those unseen voices. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every shift in the shadows, felt like a threat, like the house itself was watching, waiting for her to let her guard down. She lay there for hours, listening to the whispers, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on her. Somewhere, in the back of her mind, she knew that this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Shadowed Corners. The days passed slowly, and the air inside the house seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The oppressive feeling that had greeted Evelyn upon their arrival now clung to every corner of the house, seeping into the walls, the furniture, and even the light that streamed through the windows. It was as if the house itself had taken on a life of its own, watching, waiting for something unseen to unfold. Evelyn did her best to ignore it. She focused on her routine, unpacking, organizing, keeping the children busy. But no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, the eerie presence in the house was impossible to escape. She could feel it in every room, pressing in on her, always just beyond the edge of her vision. Jacob, oblivious to the growing dread that gnawed at her, threw himself into repairing the house. The constant creaking of the floorboards and the faint whispers had become almost normal to him, something he attributed to the age of the house. He worked late into the night, sanding down old furniture, fixing broken windows, and patching cracks in the walls. But even with his efforts, the house remained cold, as if nothing could warm the ancient bones of the place. It was the children who first noticed the shadows. One afternoon, while Evelyn was in the kitchen preparing lunch, Olivia and Sam sat in the living room, playing quietly with their toys. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. It was a rare moment of peace, the stillness of the house broken only by the sound of the children's laughter. Evelyn watched them from the kitchen, a faint smile on her lips, grateful for the brief respite from the house's oppressive atmosphere. But then Olivia stopped laughing. Her eyes widened, and she stared intently at the far corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. Sam, noticing his sister's sudden silence, looked up as well, following her gaze. They both sat still, their bodies tense as they watched something unseen move in the darkness. Evelyn's smile faded as she noticed the change in the children. She followed their gaze to the corner of the room, her heart skipping a beat. The shadows there seemed darker than usual, almost as if they had thickened, taking on a solid form. For a moment, the darkness appeared to shift, like a figure moving just beyond the light of the fire. But when Evelyn blinked, the shadows returned to normal, still and unremarkable. The children remained frozen, their eyes fixed on the corner. Evelyn stepped toward them, her breath quickening, but before she could reach them, Olivia let out a quiet gasp and looked away. Sam followed her lead, his expression troubled but silent. Neither of them said a word, and after a moment, they resumed playing as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Evelyn could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the sense of unease that had taken root in Evelyn's mind refused to leave. She couldn't stop thinking about the way the shadows had seemed to shift, as if something was hiding in them, watching her and her children from the dark corners of the house. The whispers that had haunted her were becoming more frequent now, louder, as though the house was trying to communicate something she couldn't understand. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Evelyn stood at the window in the master bedroom, staring out at the dark fields beyond the house. The sky was overcast, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon, barely visible through the fog that clung to the ground. The figure she had seen on the first night didn't return, but the memory of it haunted her as she stood there, the weight of the house pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel it now more than ever. The sense that they weren't alone, that something else was in the house with them. It wasn't just the creaking of old wood or the groaning of the wind through the windows. It was something alive, something that lurked in the shadows and the silence. She turned away from the window, her eyes scanning the room. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting a dim light that barely reached the corners of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch farther now, longer and deeper than they should have. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she stared at the dark corners, half expecting to see the figure again, standing there, waiting. But there was nothing, only darkness. Jacob stirred in his sleep, his breathing slow and steady, oblivious to the fear that gripped his wife. Evelyn slipped into bed beside him, pulling the blankets up to her chin as she lay there, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The whispers returned, faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. But soon they grew louder, more distinct, as if they were coming from the very walls around her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers were everywhere now, filling the room, seeping into her mind like a cold, creeping fog. They circled around her, pressing in closer and closer until she could almost make out the words. But no matter how hard she listened, they remained just beyond her understanding, a constant, maddening murmur. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from downstairs. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up, listening. The house was silent again, but the sound had been real. Something had moved downstairs. She glanced at Jacob, still asleep, then slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor as she crept toward the door. She stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking softly beneath her weight. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside, casting long shadows across the floor. Evelyn's breath came in shallow bursts as she made her way toward the stairs, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. At the top of the stairs, she paused, listening intently. There was nothing, just the soft whisper of the wind outside and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. But the shadows at the bottom of the stairs seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, as if something was waiting for her in the darkness below. Evelyn gripped the banister, her knuckles white with fear as she descended the stairs, one step at a time. Each step creaked loudly in the silence, her heartbeat quickening with every sound. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped, her eyes drawn to the far corner of the living room. The same corner where the children had seen something earlier that day. The shadows there were darker than they should have been, almost as if they were solid, like a mass of black smoke swirling in the corner of the room. For a moment, Evelyn thought she could see a figure standing there, tall and imposing, its face hidden in the darkness. She blinked, and the figure was gone. But the shadows remained. The whispers grew louder, filling the room now, pressing in on her from all sides. Evelyn took a step back, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The room felt colder, the air thick with an unseen presence that surrounded her, suffocating her. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The house fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting from the air, leaving only the soft crackle of the dying fire in the hearth. Evelyn stood frozen in place, her heart racing, her mind spinning. The shadows in the corner remained still, but she could feel them watching her, waiting. Chapter 4. The Hidden Room. The next morning, the house felt colder than usual. The autumn sun had barely risen, casting a pale, wintry light over the landscape outside. Inside, the shadows seemed to cling to the corners, lingering in the crevices where the light could not reach. Evelyn woke with a deep sense of unease, her mind still clouded with the memories of the night before. She went through her morning routine with mechanical precision, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The children, Olivia and Sam, were unusually quiet, as though they, too, sensed the house's brooding presence. They ate their breakfast without a word, their eyes often drifting toward the shadowy corners of the room, their usual laughter absent. Jacob was already hard at work in the back of the house, fixing a broken window in the study. The sound of hammering echoed through the empty halls, a steady rhythm that seemed to fight against the silence that pervaded the rest of the house. Evelyn found comfort in the noise, a reminder of the tangible world outside the strange happenings in the house. After cleaning up the kitchen, she decided to explore the house further. Something about the house had been bothering her from the moment they moved in. The layout, the way the rooms connected, didn't feel quite right. There was a sense of incompleteness to the place, as if certain parts of the house had been hidden or forgotten. She wandered through the upstairs hallway, her footsteps soft against the creaking wooden floors. The house was old, with its narrow corridors and steep staircases, but there was something else, something unnatural. As she moved from room to room, she felt the weight of the house pressing down on her, the same sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. At the far end of the hall, she found herself standing before a small door she hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away in the corner, partially hidden behind a tall wardrobe, and it seemed out of place. The door was different from the others, narrower, with an old brass handle that was tarnished and cold to the touch. She hadn't remembered seeing this door when they first moved in. A feeling of unease washed over her, but her curiosity won out. Slowly, she turned the handle, and the door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty hall. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The air that wafted up from the staircase was musty, stale, as though the room below had been sealed off for years. She glanced back down the hallway, half expecting Jacob or the children to appear, but the house remained silent. Summoning her courage, Evelyn stepped onto the first creaking step, the wooden boards beneath her feet feeling soft and brittle. She descended slowly, the darkness deepening with each step. A faint draft of cold air swirled up from below, making her shiver as she reached the bottom of the stairs. The room she entered was small, almost claustrophobic, with low ceilings and walls covered in dust. The faint light from the hallway barely reached into the room, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though it had been trapped here for decades. There was nothing in the room at first glance, just a bare stone floor and walls. But then, something caught Evelyn's eye. In the far corner of the room, half hidden beneath a pile of old rags, was a small, wooden box. It was ancient, covered in a fine layer of dust, its edges worn and splintered with age. Evelyn's heart raced as she approached the box, her hands trembling slightly as she knelt down to examine it. The wood was cold beneath her fingers, and there was something unsettling about the way it felt, too smooth, as though it had been handled frequently, despite its apparent age. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of old papers, yellowed with time and covered in faded ink. She pulled them out carefully, her eyes scanning the strange symbols and drawings that covered the pages. They looked like old diagrams, arcane symbols she couldn't understand, but the drawings were deeply disturbing. Depictions of shadowy figures, twisted faces, and strange creatures that seemed to crawl out of the darkness itself. One particular drawing caught her attention, a figure, shrouded in darkness, standing in a room that looked eerily similar to the one she was in now. The figure's face was blank, a shadow where its features should have been, but its presence on the page sent a chill down her spine. It felt too real, too familiar. Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder, and a faint whispering sound began to rise from the walls. The same whispers she had heard before, but now they were louder, more insistent, filling the room with their eerie, indistinct murmurs. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, the papers still clutched in her hands. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, growing darker, more oppressive. The whispering grew louder, swirling around her like a cold wind. The shadows stretched toward her, creeping along the floor and up the walls, as if they were alive, drawn to her presence. Evelyn backed away, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She turned and fled up the stairs, the box and its contents abandoned in the darkness below. As she reached the top, she slammed the door shut, her hands trembling. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched remained. She leaned against the door, trying to calm her racing heart. When she opened her eyes, she noticed something strange. The hallway seemed longer than it had been before, the shadows darker, deeper. The house itself seemed to have shifted, subtly, as though the very walls were closing in on her. A sense of dread filled her, and she felt as though the house was trying to pull her back, trying to keep her from leaving. Evelyn forced herself to move, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall as she made her way back to the living room. Jacob was there, working on the fireplace, oblivious to the terror she had just experienced. She didn't tell him about the hidden room or the strange box. She didn't even know where to begin, but she could feel the house watching her now, more intensely than before. The whispers, the shadows, the strange sense of wrongness that permeated every corner of the place. It was all connected to that hidden room. She was certain of it. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever before. They followed her through the house, into her dreams, filling her mind with dark, twisted images that she couldn't escape. The shadowy figure from the drawings haunted her, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her as she slept. When she awoke in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, the house was silent. But the feeling of being watched remained, as if the shadows were waiting just outside her door, waiting for her to return to the hidden room. Chapter 5. The Unseen Force. The morning air was crisp and heavy with the scent of wet leaves as Evelyn woke with a start, her heart pounding. The remnants of her nightmares still clung to her mind. Vivid images of the shadowy figure from the hidden room, watching her from the corner of every dream. She lay still in bed, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, half expecting to see it standing at the foot of her bed, just as it had in her dreams. But the room was empty, bathed in the pale light of dawn that filtered through the curtains. Beside her, Jacob slept soundly, undisturbed by the night's events. The quiet rise and fall of his chest was a stark contrast to the unease that gnawed at Evelyn. She slipped out of bed quietly, her bare feet touching the cold floor. The wooden boards beneath her creaked softly as she tiptoed out of the room, careful not to wake him. The house was eerily silent, the oppressive weight of the night before still hanging in the air. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Evelyn made her way down the narrow hallway, her eyes flicking to the hidden door at the end of the corridor. She avoided looking at it for too long, as if staring too long would somehow draw the attention of whatever lay beyond it. Instead, she descended the staircase to the first floor. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and as she reached the bottom step, the familiar feeling of being watched crept up her spine. The living room, which had once felt warm and inviting, now seemed shadowed and cold, the fireplace empty and the windows clouded with condensation. Olivia and Sam were still asleep upstairs, and the house seemed unnervingly still without the usual sound of their footsteps or laughter. Evelyn busied herself in the kitchen, trying to distract her mind from the gnawing dread. She prepared breakfast with trembling hands, but her eyes kept drifting to the corners of the room, to the shadows that seemed to dance just out of reach. The whispers, though faint, were always there, like a low hum in the background, impossible to ignore. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from upstairs. Evelyn froze, her hands pausing mid-motion as the sound echoed through the house. It was followed by another thud, and then a sharp creak of wood, as though something heavy had been moved. She set down the bowl she had been holding and made her way to the staircase, her heart racing. At the top of the stairs, the hallway seemed darker than usual, the shadows pooling at the edges like thick ink. She walked cautiously toward the children's room, every step feeling heavier than the last. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as she was about to open the door, she felt a sudden rush of cold air behind her. Evelyn spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The hidden door at the end of the hall was wide open. She had closed it. She was certain of that. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the open doorway, the darkness beyond it yawning like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. She wanted to move, to close the door, to seal away whatever lurked in the hidden room. But her feet felt rooted to the floor, her body paralyzed by fear. The shadows seemed to ripple, almost as if they were alive, shifting and undulating in the darkness beyond the door. A low hum filled the hallway, a sound that resonated deep within her bones, and the air grew colder, more oppressive. The unseen force that had been lurking in the house was here now, right in front of her, and it was no longer hiding in the corners. Suddenly, the door to the children's room creaked open, and Evelyn's paralysis broke. She rushed inside, her heart pounding in her chest as she scanned the room. Olivia and Sam were still asleep, their small forms bundled under the blankets, oblivious to the terror unfolding just outside their door. Evelyn closed the door softly, her hands shaking as she locked it behind her. She pressed her back against the door, trying to catch her breath, her mind racing. Whatever was in the house was getting stronger. It wasn't just whispers in the night or shadows in the corners anymore. It was real, tangible, and it was coming for them. After a few moments, she steeled herself and made her way back to the hidden door. It still stood open, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. The cold air that wafted up from the hidden staircase sent shivers down her spine, and for a moment, she considered waking Jacob, telling him everything, but something stopped her. Deep down, She knew this was something she had to face alone. She stepped toward the open door, her feet moving of their own accord, as if drawn by some unseen force. The air seemed to hum around her, growing louder and more oppressive with each step. Her hand reached out, and before she could stop herself, she was gripping the edge of the door, peering into the blackness beyond. For a long moment, nothing happened. The darkness remained still, silent, as though whatever had been stirring in the house had retreated. But just as Evelyn turned to close the door, she felt it, an icy grip around her wrist. She gasped, pulling her hand back, but the force tightened, invisible fingers digging into her skin. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt, and it sent a shock of pain up her arm. The grip was relentless, tugging her toward the darkness, pulling her into the hidden room. Evelyn struggled, her breath coming in panicked gasps as she fought to free herself. But the force was too strong. It yanked her forward, her feet sliding across the floor as she was dragged toward the open doorway. The shadows seemed to writhe, growing darker, more menacing, as they closed in around her. In a last-ditch effort, Evelyn threw herself backward, her body slamming against the wall as she tore her arm free from the icy grip. She stumbled, falling to the floor, her heart racing as she scrambled away from the door. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the blackness, and the door swung shut with a loud bang. The hallway fell silent, the oppressive air lifting slightly, but Evelyn could still feel the cold lingering on her skin, a reminder of the force that had tried to pull her into the darkness. Her hands shook as she stood up, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Whatever was in the hidden room, it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something ancient and malevolent, and it had reached out for her. She couldn't deny it any longer. The house was alive with something dark, something that wanted to consume her and her family. And it was growing stronger, more dangerous, with each passing day. Evelyn locked the hidden door, her heart still pounding in her chest, and hurried back downstairs. She couldn't stay in the house much longer. She had to find a way to protect her family, to fight back against the unseen force that haunted them. But she didn't know where to start. For now, all she could do was watch, wait, and hope that the shadows didn't come for her again. Chapter 6. The Shadows Close In. The days following the encounter with the unseen force passed in a blur for Evelyn. Every waking moment was tinged with a sense of dread, and even her sleep offered no reprieve from the house's grip on her. The nightmares had grown worse, more vivid. In her dreams, the shadowy figure from the hidden room loomed larger, watching her from every dark corner, following her wherever she went. She had tried to ignore it, to act as though everything was normal for the sake of the children. Olivia and Sam seemed blissfully unaware of the growing tension in the house, though they occasionally complained about cold drafts and strange noises at night. Jacob, too, was either oblivious to the sinister presence or chose not to acknowledge it, busying himself with repairs and renovations around the property. Evelyn envied him for his ignorance. The air in the house felt heavier now, as if it were saturated with an invisible weight pressing down on her. Each step through the hallways seemed to require more effort, as though something was resisting her every movement. The shadows clung to the walls more stubbornly than ever, and the dark corners seemed to pulse with life, alive with the same whispers she could never quite make out. One evening, as dusk settled over the house, Evelyn found herself standing in the kitchen, staring blankly out of the window. The autumn wind whipped through the trees, sending leaves spiraling across the yard, their colors fading with the onset of winter. Inside, the house felt unnaturally still, the only sound the occasional creak of wood expanding with the cooling temperature. She had spent most of the day cleaning, hoping that by keeping herself busy, she could push away the oppressive fear that gripped her. But now, as the day faded and the shadows lengthened, the familiar weight of unease settled over her once again. The clock ticked loudly in the hallway, each second echoing through the silent house. As Evelyn turned away from the window, her gaze drifted to the staircase leading up to the second floor. She froze. At the top of the stairs, just barely visible in the dim light, a shadowy figure stood, unmoving. It was the same figure from her dreams, its face obscured, its presence undeniable. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought it was a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination. But as she blinked, the figure remained, still as a statue, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Evelyn's first instinct was to call for Jacob, but no sound escaped her lips. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure at the top of the stairs. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, growing darker, denser, as if feeding off its presence. The house felt colder, the air growing thick with tension as the figure continued to stand there, silent and menacing. Suddenly, the figure moved. It didn't walk, didn't step forward in any natural way. Instead, it seemed to glide, its body shifting fluidly as it descended the stairs. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, frozen in place, as the figure grew closer and closer, its form becoming more defined with each passing second. Its movements were unnatural, almost liquid, as if it were more shadow than substance. Without thinking, Evelyn backed away, her feet stumbling over the uneven floor. She felt a wave of cold wash over her as the figure reached the bottom of the stairs, still moving with an eerie grace. It stopped just before entering the kitchen, its head tilting slightly as though studying her, waiting for her to make the next move. Panic surged through her. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing loudly as she fled toward the back of the house. Her body moved on instinct, driven by pure fear. She reached the back door, her hands fumbling with the latch as she tried to wrench it open, but it was stuck, jammed in place as though the house itself were holding it shut. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her hands trembling as she pulled desperately at the handle. Behind her, she could feel the figure approaching. The air grew colder still, almost suffocating, as its presence loomed closer. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and shift, stretching toward her like black tendrils, reaching out to pull her back into their depths. With a final tug, the door flew open, and Evelyn stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting her like a wall. She gasped for breath, her lungs burning as she dashed into the backyard, her bare feet slipping on the wet grass. She didn't stop until she reached the far end of the yard, where the old oak tree stood tall and silent. She collapsed against the tree, her back pressing into the rough bark as she tried to steady her breathing. The house loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, its windows like empty eyes staring back at her. The figure was no longer in sight, but Evelyn could still feel its presence, lurking somewhere within the walls, waiting. For a long time, she stayed there, shivering in the cold, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She couldn't deny it anymore. The house was alive with something dark, something ancient and malevolent. It had shown itself to her now, revealed its true form, and it wanted her. She didn't know why or what it was, but she knew that it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. After what felt like hours, she finally stood, her legs weak and shaky. She couldn't stay out here all night, but the thought of returning to the house filled her with dread. She glanced back toward the house, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, waiting for her return. But the yard was empty, the windows dark. Slowly, cautiously, Evelyn made her way back to the house. The door was still open, swinging gently in the wind, and the kitchen was just as she had left it. The figure was gone, but the house felt no less oppressive. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and immediately felt the weight of the house settle over her again. She moved through the house on shaky legs, checking each room for any sign of the shadowy figure, but everything was still. The children were asleep upstairs, undisturbed by the night's events, and Jacob remained in his workshop, oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded. Evelyn stood in the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The figure had followed her, chased her out of the house, but it hadn't harmed her. Not yet, at least, but it was growing stronger, more confident, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it struck. The house creaked and groaned around her, the familiar sounds now carrying an air of menace. She felt trapped, cornered, as though the walls were closing in on her. The hidden room, the whispers, the shadowy figure. It was all connected, part of something much larger and much darker than she had imagined. As she stood there, Lost in thought, she felt a sudden shift in the air. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but then it grew, a slow, creeping cold that spread through the room like a fog. The shadows on the walls seemed to deepen, stretching out toward her, and the air grew thick with the same low hum she had heard before. Evelyn's heart raced as she backed away from the living room, her instincts telling her to run, to get out of the house before it was too late. But something kept her rooted in place, a strange, inexplicable pull that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The whispers returned, louder now, more distinct. They swirled around her, filling the room with their dissonant murmur, and the shadows seemed to close in, pressing against her from all sides. Evelyn turned and fled up the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground as she rushed to the second floor. She threw open the door to the children's room, her heart pounding in her chest. Olivia and Sam were still asleep, their faces peaceful and undisturbed. She watched them for a moment, her fear momentarily giving way to relief. But then, the shadows crept under the door, silent and fluid, slipping into the room like a wave of darkness. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she watched the shadows approach, her mind screaming for her to run, to protect her children from whatever was coming. The house groaned again, a low, eerie sound that reverberated through the walls, and Evelyn knew that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 7. The Haunting Escalates. The following morning dawned with a pale, overcast sky, casting a grayish tint over the house. The sunlight struggled to penetrate through the dense clouds, leaving everything in a dim, almost twilight-like atmosphere. Inside the house, Evelyn awoke with a deep sense of exhaustion, though she couldn't remember exactly when she had fallen asleep. Her dreams had been plagued by the same dark presence, its shadowy figure lurking just out of sight. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to gather her thoughts. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind. The figure at the top of the stairs, the oppressive cold, the shadows creeping into the children's room. It had all felt so real, but now, in the weak morning light, she wondered if her mind had conjured it in the grip of fear and fatigue. Jacob was already up, his side of the bed empty. She could hear the distant sounds of his movements downstairs, the faint clattering of dishes in the kitchen. The children were still asleep in their rooms, the house eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the low hum of the wind outside. Evelyn forced herself to get out of bed, her body heavy with fatigue. She dressed quickly, her mind racing with the ever-present sense of unease that had now settled over her like a second skin. As she made her way down the stairs, she felt the familiar weight of the house pressing down on her again, as though the walls were alive, watching her every move. In the kitchen, Jacob was busy preparing breakfast, his back to her as he stood at the stove. The smell of coffee filled the air, a small comfort in the midst of the lingering tension. He seemed relaxed, oblivious to the terror that had gripped her the night before. Evelyn envied him, his ability to go about his day as though nothing was wrong. But something was wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. She moved through the house quietly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet as she made her way toward the living room. The room was as it had been the night before, the shadows now retreating in the weak daylight, but the air still felt thick, heavy with something unseen. As she stood in the center of the room, her eyes were drawn to the hallway that led to the hidden room, the room she had discovered when they first moved in. She hadn't ventured inside since that day, but now, standing there, she felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as though the house itself was beckoning her. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, before slowly making her way toward the hallway. The closer she got, the colder the air became, until it felt as though she were walking into a freezer. Her breath came out in soft puffs, visible in the icy air. The door to the hidden room stood ajar, just as she had left it. A low creak echoed through the hallway as she pushed the door open fully, revealing the dark, cramped space beyond. The room was as she remembered it, dusty, old, and forgotten, with the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. But something was different now. The room felt alive, humming with a low, vibrating energy that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The shadows inside the room were darker, denser, as if they were hiding something just beyond the edge of her vision. She stepped inside cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. In the far corner of the room, the small wooden chair sat where she had first seen it, its legs covered in a thin layer of dust. But now, something else caught her eye, a faint glimmer of light reflecting off the chair's surface. She squinted, stepping closer, and realized that there was something resting on the seat. It was a small, ornate box, covered in intricate carvings that looked ancient, worn down by time. The box seemed completely out of place in the otherwise barren room, as though it had been waiting for her to find it. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. As soon as she touched the box, the temperature in the room dropped even further, a biting cold that pierced her skin and settled deep in her bones. Her breath came in short gasps as she lifted the box, feeling its surprising weight. It was heavier than it looked, and as she held it in her hands, she could feel a strange warmth radiating from within. She carried the box back into the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. The moment she crossed the threshold back into the main part of the house, the temperature returned to normal, the suffocating cold receding as though it had been confined to the hidden room. Evelyn placed the box on the coffee table in the living room, staring at it for what felt like hours. Something about it unnerved her, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. The carvings on its surface seemed to shift and twist in the dim light, forming patterns that defied logic. It was as though the box was alive, holding some dark secret within its confines. The children woke soon after, their footsteps thundering down the stairs, breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the house. Evelyn jumped at the sound, her heart still racing as she turned away from the box. She busied herself with breakfast, trying to shake off the lingering dread that clung to her, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the hidden room, the box, and the strange cold that seemed to be getting worse. The day passed uneventfully, though the air inside the house remained thick with tension. Olivia and Sam played outside for most of the afternoon, their laughter a stark contrast to the heavy silence that hung over the house. Jacob spent the day working in the garage, oblivious to the growing sense of unease that gripped Evelyn. She moved through the motions of her day in a daze, her mind constantly drawn back to the box sitting in the living room. That night, as the house grew dark once more, Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body tense with anticipation. She knew the shadows would return, that the house would come alive with its sinister presence. She felt it in her bones, the same creeping cold that had been slowly tightening its grip on her since they had moved in. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though the very air had been sucked out of the rooms. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of the hidden room and the box. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made her heart skip a beat, her body tensing with fear. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she slipped out of bed and made her way downstairs. The house felt different at night, more alive, as though it were watching her with unseen eyes. She walked into the living room, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The box was still there, sitting on the coffee table, untouched. Its surface gleamed faintly in the moonlight streaming through the window, the intricate carvings casting long shadows on the floor. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, before reaching for the box once again. The moment her fingers brushed against the surface, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, just as it had in the hidden room. The cold was biting, almost painful, as though the box itself was trying to push her away. But Evelyn didn't pull back. She gripped the box tightly, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of dark velvet, was a small, delicate key. As soon as the lid was open, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, growing darker and more oppressive. The cold intensified, and the familiar whispering began, louder now, more insistent. The air around her grew thick, the shadows pressing in from all sides, suffocating her with their weight. Evelyn gasped for breath, her vision blurring as the darkness closed in. The key gleamed faintly in the moonlight, its surface cold to the touch as she lifted it from the box. She didn't know what the key was for, but deep down, she knew it was connected to the house, to the shadows that haunted her every waking moment. As she stood there, holding the key in her trembling hands, she felt the full weight of the house's malevolent presence bearing down on her. The shadows twisted and writhed around her, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. Whatever the key unlocked, it would either save her family or doom them all. Chapter 8: Descent into the Darkness. The house lay in stillness once again as the midnight hour approached, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional groan of the old wooden beams. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the cracks in the windows, making the trees sway violently in the darkness. Inside, the temperature continued to drop, the cold settling in as if it had always belonged there. Evelyn stood in the center of the living room, the small key still clutched tightly in her hand. She hadn't slept in days. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from the constant strain of fear and exhaustion. The dark circles beneath her eyes gave her a gaunt, haunted appearance, as if the house itself had slowly been draining her life away. But she couldn't stop now. There was no turning back. The key felt cold in her palm, its weight unnaturally heavy for something so small. She stared at it, trying to make sense of its purpose. There had to be a reason the box had been hidden away in that forgotten room, a reason the house was guarding this secret so fiercely. The key was the answer. She was certain of it. The house had been leading her here from the beginning. Jacob and the children were asleep upstairs, unaware of the battle that was being waged beneath their roof. The malevolent force that inhabited the house had become more active, more aggressive with each passing night, and yet they seemed unaffected, untouched by the shadows that clung to Evelyn like a second skin. It was as if the darkness had chosen her, marked her as its target. She moved through the house slowly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the creaky floorboards. The shadows followed her, stretching and shifting along the walls, their presence a constant reminder of the unseen force lurking just beyond the edge of perception. The air was thick with tension, every breath she took feeling labored, as if the very atmosphere were pressing down on her. Evelyn knew where she needed to go. The hidden room. The key had to fit somewhere within those walls. There was no other explanation. She made her way down the hallway, the cold intensifying with every step she took. Her breath fogged in front of her, the temperature now so low it felt as if she were walking through a winter storm. The door to the hidden room loomed before her, slightly ajar, just as she had left it. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But there was nowhere to go. This was her home, her family's home, and whatever darkness had taken root here, she had to face it. For them. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air in the room was even colder than before, a biting chill that seeped into her bones. The shadows here were thicker, darker, as if the room itself were alive with the malevolent presence that had been tormenting her. The walls seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic energy, like the heartbeat of something ancient and evil. Evelyn's eyes scanned the room, searching for any clue as to where the key might fit. Her gaze settled on the far wall, where the wooden chair still sat in its lonely corner. Above it, half hidden in the shadows, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, rectangular indentation in the wall, just large enough to fit the key. Her pulse quickened. This was it. She approached the wall cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the empty room. The shadows seemed to ripple around her, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways, as though they were alive, watching her every move. The closer she got to the indentation, the colder the air became, until it felt like her skin was freezing solid. Evelyn raised the key to the indentation, her hand trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The moment the key slid into place, a loud, grinding noise echoed through the room, as if ancient gears were turning deep within the walls. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble, the very foundation of the house shaking with the force of whatever had been set into motion. Slowly, a hidden door began to reveal itself in the wall, the outline of it becoming more pronounced as the grinding noise grew louder. The door was made of the same dark wood as the rest of the house, its surface covered in strange symbols and carvings that looked ancient, almost primal. The sight of it sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. She reached for the door handle, her heart hammering in her chest. Whatever lay beyond this door, she knew it held the answers she had been searching for. The house had been guiding her here all along, pulling her deeper into its web of darkness. But now, standing on the precipice of the unknown, she hesitated. A low rumble echoed through the room, the walls vibrating with a deep, resonant energy. The shadows writhed and twisted around her, their movements growing more frantic, more aggressive. The air grew thick with the oppressive sense of dread that had been building since the moment they moved into the house. Evelyn swallowed hard, steeling herself for whatever lay beyond. She gripped the handle tightly and pulled the door open. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bricks, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. A cold draft wafted up from the depths, carrying with it the faint sound of whispering voices, too low to make out but unmistakably human. Evelyn hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the stairs. She descended slowly, the weight of the darkness pressing in around her with every step. The further she went, the colder and more oppressive the air became, as though the very atmosphere were trying to suffocate her. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, cramped chamber. The walls were damp, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust and grime. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface covered in strange symbols and markings that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. On the altar rested a single, blackened object, a book, ancient and worn, its pages yellowed with age. Evelyn approached the altar cautiously, her eyes locked on the book. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that made her skin crawl. The air around her seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, the same energy that had been present in the hidden room upstairs. She reached out and touched the book. The moment her fingers made contact with its surface, a jolt of energy shot through her body, like a surge of electricity. The room around her seemed to pulse with life, the walls vibrating with a deep, rhythmic energy that echoed through the chamber. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, as though they were speaking directly into her mind. Evelyn's hand trembled as she opened the book, its brittle pages crackling under her touch. The words on the pages were written in a language she didn't recognize, strange symbols and markings that seemed to shift and change as she stared at them. But despite the unfamiliarity of the text, she understood its meaning. The book was a record of the house's dark history, a history steeped in blood and sacrifice. It told the story of the house's original owners, a family that had dabbled in dark rituals, summoning a malevolent force that had been bound to the property for centuries. The rituals had been performed in this very chamber, the altar a focal point for the darkness that had been unleashed. Evelyn's heart raced as she flipped through the pages, the story becoming clearer with each turn. The force that haunted the house had been feeding off the fear and pain of its inhabitants for generations, growing stronger with each soul it consumed. The key she had found was part of the ritual, a way to unlock the force and either banish it or release it completely. As she reached the final page of the book, Evelyn felt a cold hand brush against her skin. She gasped, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the shadows in the room seemed to close in around her. The walls pulsed with energy, the air thick with the presence of the malevolent force that had been waiting, watching, biding its time. The book had shown her the way. The key was not just to unlock the door, but to unlock the force itself. Evelyn's hand trembled as she realized the choice that lay before her. The force could be banished, but it required a sacrifice, her own. Chapter 9. The Ritual. The air in the chamber grew colder with each passing moment, the shadows in the room pulsating with a dark, rhythmic energy. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, the ancient book open in front of her. The whispers had grown louder, their voices a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs that filled her mind, making it difficult to concentrate. The altar before her was bathed in a dim, eerie light that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the chamber. The symbols carved into the stone were illuminated with a faint, ghostly glow, their shapes twisting and shifting in the darkness. Evelyn's eyes darted around the room, her gaze falling on the small ritualistic tools scattered around the altar: candles, incense, and strange, unidentifiable objects that hinted at the dark practices of the house's original inhabitants. With trembling hands, Evelyn gathered the items she needed. The ritual described in the book was clear in its instructions, but the weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily upon her. The shadows seemed to close in tighter around her, their presence growing more oppressive, as though they were aware of her intentions and were trying to thwart her at every turn. She arranged the candles around the altar, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The incense burned slowly, its smoke curling up into the air, creating an almost tangible haze that added to the oppressive atmosphere. Evelyn moved with practiced precision, her movements steady despite the fear that gripped her. The book described a series of incantations and movements that would help focus the ritual's energy. Evelyn followed the instructions meticulously, her actions fluid and deliberate. Each movement seemed to draw the shadows closer, the air growing heavier with each step. The whispers grew louder, a relentless tide of sound that threatened to drown out her thoughts. She placed the final object, the small, ornate dagger, on the altar. Its surface was etched with symbols that matched those on the book, and as she touched it, she felt a jolt of cold energy pass through her. The dagger was crucial to the ritual, a key element in binding or banishing the malevolent force that had taken hold of the house. Evelyn took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. The ritual had to be completed. There was no other way. The house had chosen her, and now she had to see it through to the end. The lives of her family depended on it. She picked up the book once more and began to chant the incantations written within its pages. The words felt foreign on her tongue, their sounds strange and unsettling. As she spoke them aloud, she felt the room respond, the shadows growing darker, more animated. The air vibrated with a low, humming energy that seemed to resonate with the words she was reciting. The temperature in the room dropped further, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into her very being. Evelyn's breath came in frosty puffs, her body shaking from the cold and the intensity of the ritual. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, their forms becoming more defined, almost tangible. They moved with purpose now, as if drawn to the energy of the ritual, their presence an ever-growing threat. As she reached the climax of the ritual, Evelyn picked up the dagger, her hand steady despite the fear that clawed at her insides. The book had instructed her to make a sacrifice, to offer something of herself to the darkness in exchange for her family's safety. It was the only way to ensure the ritual's success. She closed her eyes, focusing on the book's final instructions. The shadows around her grew more restless, their movements frantic, almost desperate. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of urgency, the malevolent force sensing its impending confrontation. Evelyn made the necessary incision, the dagger slicing through her skin with a sharp, stinging pain. The blood dripped onto the altar, mingling with the incense smoke and the flickering candlelight. The shadows around her seemed to recoil from the sight, their forms writhing in a chaotic dance of anger and fear. The room grew darker, the shadows merging into a single, swirling mass. The whispers became a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices that seemed to merge into a singular, malevolent presence. Evelyn's heart raced as she continued the ritual, her body trembling with the effort. With one final, decisive movement, she completed the ritual's final incantation. The air in the room crackled with energy, the shadows convulsing violently as though they were being torn apart from within. The oppressive cold seemed to reach its peak before suddenly dissipating, leaving the room in a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Evelyn fell to her knees, exhausted and trembling, her strength spent. The shadows that had once filled the room were now gone, their presence replaced by a profound, eerie calm. The altar was quiet, the candles burning steadily, their light now casting a warm, gentle glow. She remained there for a long moment, trying to catch her breath and steady her racing heart. The silence was almost deafening, the absence of the whispers a strange relief. The malevolent force that had haunted the house seemed to have been banished, its presence no longer suffocating her every waking moment. As she stood up, Her body aching and her mind foggy with fatigue, she glanced around the room one last time. The chamber was still and silent, the shadows no longer a looming threat. It was over. For now, at least. The house had been quieted, its darkness pushed back into the depths from which it had come. Evelyn made her way back up the stairs, each step heavy with exhaustion. The house seemed different now. The oppressive weight of its malevolent presence lifted. The shadows that had once seemed to whisper and crawl were gone, replaced by a calm, almost peaceful atmosphere. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused for a moment, her gaze falling on the closed door of her children's room. She could hear their soft, steady breathing, a comforting reminder of what she had fought to protect. Her family was safe, at least for now. As she walked back to her room, the weight of the ritual and the house's dark history slowly began to lift from her shoulders. She could feel the warmth of the house returning, the once cold air now filled with a gentle, reassuring warmth. The shadows had been pushed back, their influence diminished, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Evelyn allowed herself to hope for a future free from the darkness that had plagued them. She collapsed into bed, her body aching with exhaustion, but her mind finally at peace. The house was quiet, its malevolent presence banished. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the deep, restful sleep wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was over, that the darkness had been driven away, and that her family could finally live in peace. Chapter 10: Dawn of Peace. The first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the curtains, casting a soft, golden glow across the house. The shadows that had once been so oppressive were now mere wisps of darkness, retreating with the night. The oppressive weight that had hung over the house for so long had lifted, replaced by a serene calm that seemed to envelop every room. Evelyn awoke to the gentle light streaming through the window. She stirred slowly, her body still weary from the previous night's ordeal. The fatigue weighed heavily on her, but there was a new sense of tranquility in the air, an almost palpable peace that filled the house. She sat up, taking in the calm surroundings, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a deep sense of relief. She moved through the house with careful, deliberate steps, her movements quiet and gentle. Each room she entered seemed to be bathed in a soft, warm light, the shadows that had once clung to the corners now gone. The oppressive cold that had pervaded the house was replaced by a soothing warmth, the air feeling fresh and clean. Evelyn's eyes fell upon the door to the hidden chamber. It was now firmly closed, the ominous energy that had once emanated from it replaced by a sense of calm. She approached the door cautiously, her hand resting lightly on the handle. The door was no longer the source of fear and darkness. It was simply a door, a part of the house's past. She opened the door, revealing the chamber within. The altar was still there, but it no longer seemed threatening. The candles had burned down to stubs, their light having long since faded. The strange symbols on the walls no longer glowed with an eerie light. They were simply carvings, a reminder of the house's history. Evelyn walked over to the altar, her eyes taking in the now quiet book. The ritual had been successful. The darkness had been driven away. The oppressive weight that had once been so overwhelming was gone, replaced by a sense of stillness and peace. She picked up the book and carefully placed it back in its spot on the altar, her fingers brushing lightly against its worn cover. The ritual had been completed, the malevolent force banished, and the house was finally free from its grip. Evelyn took a deep breath, her eyes closing for a moment as she allowed herself to feel the full impact of the peace that had settled over the house. Downstairs, the sounds of the household waking up gradually began to fill the air. The children's laughter echoed softly through the halls, their voices a comforting reminder of the normalcy that had returned. Evelyn made her way back to the kitchen, where the warm, inviting scent of breakfast greeted her. Jacob was already up, his movements calm and relaxed. He moved about the kitchen with a sense of ease that had been missing for so long. The warmth and light of the morning sun illuminated his features, casting a gentle glow that seemed to enhance the peaceful atmosphere. Evelyn joined him, her presence a quiet reassurance. She watched as he prepared breakfast, the simple act of cooking a soothing ritual in itself. The kitchen, once a place of tension and unease, was now filled with a sense of calm and normalcy. The air was fresh and clean, the oppressive atmosphere of the past days replaced by a welcoming warmth. As they sat down to eat, the children joined them, their faces bright with the innocent joy of a new day. They chatted and laughed, their voices a joyful contrast to the silence of the previous nights. Evelyn watched them with a deep sense of gratitude, her heart swelling with love and relief. The breakfast table was filled with the sounds of clinking cutlery and cheerful conversation. The house, now free from its dark past, felt alive with a new sense of vitality. The oppressive shadows were gone, replaced by the warm embrace of the morning light. After breakfast, Evelyn and Jacob decided to take a walk through the garden. The air was crisp and fresh, the morning sun casting a golden light on the blooming flowers and lush greenery. The garden, which had once seemed like a desolate wasteland, was now a vibrant, welcoming space. The flowers were in full bloom, their colors vivid and bright, a symbol of the new beginning that awaited them. As they walked through the garden, Evelyn and Jacob shared a moment of quiet reflection. The peace that had settled over the house was a testament to the strength and courage they had shown in confronting the darkness. The house, once a place of fear and turmoil, had been transformed into a sanctuary of light and love. The children played nearby, their laughter a joyful sound that filled the garden with life. Evelyn watched them with a sense of pride and relief, knowing that they were safe and that the darkness had been driven away. The shadows that had once haunted their home were now nothing more than a distant memory. As the day wore on, the house continued to bask in the warmth of the sun. The rooms were filled with light and laughter, the oppressive silence of the past replaced by the joyful sounds of a family reunited. Evelyn felt a deep sense of contentment, her heart full of gratitude for the new beginning that lay before them. The evening came, and with it, a peaceful calm settled over the house. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light through the windows, bathing the rooms in a soft, comforting glow. Evelyn and Jacob sat together in the living room, their hands intertwined, their faces reflecting the quiet joy of the day. As they sat there, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its dark history finally put to rest. The oppressive presence that had once loomed over them was gone, replaced by the serene peace of a home freed from its past. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the warmth and light that now filled the house. The nightmare was over, and in its place was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild and start anew. The darkness had been vanquished, and the house was finally at peace. With a final, deep breath, Evelyn opened her eyes and looked around the room. The house, now a place of warmth and love, was a testament to their strength and perseverance. The shadows were gone, replaced by the gentle embrace of the morning light. The new day was dawning, and with it, the promise of a bright, hopeful future.